Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising podcast, where we are dedicated to busting the myths and stereotypes surrounding Appalachia by diving into our region's history and interviewing the hell-raising hillbillies that call this place their home. I'm your host, Chelsea. I grew up in the Great Smoky Mountains of southern Appalachia in western North Carolina, where I have stayed put my whole life because I just can't seem to bring myself to leave. And I've dedicated the last 10 years or so of my life to rural community organizing right here, which eventually led me to making this podcast. In today's episode, we are picking up where we left off back in episode 5 from 2 weeks ago. At that point, we were at the end of World War I, when about half of West Virginia's mines were unionized, following the tumultuous labor organizing efforts at the beginning of the 1900s, and we were making our way towards the Battle of Blair Mountain. But there's a lot that happens in 1920 and 1921 leading up to the Battle of Blair. So this episode also touches on the Battle of the Tug, the Matewan Massacre, and of course the march on Logan County that ultimately comes to a head at Blair Mountain. Honestly, we could do multiple parts on this one, but we'll have to do a multi-parter another time. I'm building up quite the list of deep dive episodes that we're going to get into whenever our time and our ADHD allow. But before we dig into today's episode, let's take care of some of our housekeeping business. First, I want to give a shout out to Thomas and to Ben O, our latest 2 supporters of the show over on our Ko-Fi page. Thomas has been super supportive on our social medias as well, and Ben is a longtime friend from the mountains of Western NC. I really appreciate y'all for helping make this show possible. So that Ko-Fi page that I mentioned works as a source of crowdfunding to help us keep the show up and running, kind of like a Patreon, but even better in a lot of ways, because if you don't want to be a monthly contributor, then you can make a one-time donation, kind of like throwing some money in a tip jar for us, or you can buy some of the merch featured in our shop. If you do feel inspired to become a monthly contributor to the show, then you'll get access to some sweet perks like bonus episodes, our Discord server, and other fun little treats. The funds that come in from our Ko-Fi page help us cover the cost of the software that we use to distribute episodes to all of the streaming platforms that y'all listen on, like Spotify and Google Pods, as well as the materials that we buy for research, like books and equipment that helps keep the quality of the show top-notch for your listening pleasure. And half the profits that come in from the show are donated to organizations up and down the mountain range that are doing good work for our communities across Appalachia. Since we launched in mid-June, we plan on taking half the profits collected between the launch date and the end of July and donating them to the Pulaski County Free Store, who we interviewed back in the second episode. And if you didn't hear that one, it's definitely time for you to boot, scoot, and boogie over there and give it a listen. And before I forget, if you want to support the page over on our Ko-Fi, that is spelled K-O like knockout hyphen fi.com/rednecksrising. That brings us to the next thing on our list for today, which is Christopher's trivia question of the day.
Hey, Chelsea.
Hey, Chris.
Since this week you were talking about mountains, I figured it'd be a good week to ask, what is the tallest peak in the Appalachian Mountains?
Ooh, this is a good one, and I think I actually know the answer to this one. You'll have to stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out the answer for yourself. Alrighty, I do believe that brings us to the meat of this episode. So y'all, grab your fork, your plate, and your napkin, because this one gets juicy. Pull up a chair, let's dig in. Over the last 3 episodes, we have spent our time exploring the carefully interwoven and a little bit more than mildly confusing web of race, class, and labor across Appalachian and American history, starting from the colonization of this continent under the pretenses of establishing colonies solely as a business venture meant to earn a profit for the British wealthy elite. We traveled through space and time during our episodes each week until episode 5, 2 weeks ago, brought us to the birth of the Mine Wars and wrapped up when we were in the year 1913 or so. Today, let us actually back up just a little bit and set the stage for ourselves. Let's begin our story on March 12th, 1883. That's when the first carload of coal was being transported from Tazewell County, Virginia, on the Norfolk and Western Railway. This new railroad opened a gateway to the untapped coal fields of southwestern West Virginia so that coal could finally be easily transported into the larger market. Virtually overnight, new towns were created as the region was transformed from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. With the lure of good wages and inexpensive housing, thousands of European immigrants rushed into southern West Virginia. Simultaneously, large numbers of African Americans migrated in from the southern states. Most of these new West Virginians found themselves becoming part of an economic system that was totally controlled by the coal industry. The new towns that were popping up, those were built by the coal operators. In order to even do the work in the company mines that they had been hired to do, miners had to pay to lease company tools and equipment from company stores. The only housing available in the company towns was, of course, company-owned housing. Without any alternative for purchasing goods or housing, the company towns and their stores were able to charge super inflated prices. And just to make sure that the miners wouldn't be able to break their loyalty and spend their money anywhere else, coal companies developed their own monetary system, where miners were paid in what was called scrip, which was a form of currency that, of course, couldn't be used anywhere other than the company stores. That meant that whenever the wages would rise, of course, so would the prices at the company store. So it's no exaggeration when I say that there was no getting ahead for the workers. Children attended company schools, company doctors provided medical care, company preachers would preach the gospel of the coal mine owners. And when a miner was injured, killed, or joined a union, the company would force their family members out of the company housing where they lived, often using violence if necessary. The short and sweet version of what I'm trying to say in this recap is that company-owned towns basically gave coal operators complete control over the lives of their workers, far beyond the scope of the mine itself. Control socially, control politically, economically, and personally. For those of you familiar with feudalism, well, this was just the updated version. And no one in any position of power was doing anything to put a stop to this clear abuse of control at the hands of the industry elite. The state and the federal government left the miners to fend for themselves, totally disregarding the abuse and suffering that they were enduring. If all this wasn't bad enough, the mines were literally a death trap for workers, especially in West Virginia. Between 1890 and 1912, West Virginia had a higher mine death rate than any other state. On December 6th of 1907, an explosion at a mine owned by the Fairmont Coal Company in Marion County killed 361. I even read about one historian that suggested that during World War I, a U.S. soldier had a better statistical chance of surviving in battle than did a West Virginian working in the coal mines. And then, of course, you've got the fact that poor working folks were constantly having the narrative warped to undermine any attempt to organize for better working conditions. I was reading one article during my research that brought me back to some of what came up in episode 1 about how poor working class white folks have always been pit as stupid, reactive, ignorant, and hot-headed. If anything else, just solely for the sake of being able to write off the reactions that they do have and to incentivize other working folks of color to avoid organizing together across race lines. We talked about in episode 1 about how the term redneck, at one point in an attempt to undermine these organizing efforts, even came to be known to be associated with communism, like to the point of being able to use other words that referred to communists interchangeably with the word redneck, all in an effort to write off the unionization efforts of the coal miners as like foreign plants with an anti-American political agenda. And as they say, fashion always repeats itself, so don't even get me started on how this continues today with the whole communist anti-American political agenda rhetoric. But the reason that I thought of all of this is because the article described Wilma Steele, who was a founding member of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. And she talked about what she said was what made the situation worse during this period of volatile worker uprisings was the contempt that outsiders had for miners in that region. Locals had a reputation for being violent and unreasonable, and it set the stereotype that they were used to feuding, and they were people who don't care about anything but a gun and a bottle of liquor. And that was the propaganda. But these people were being abused. And does that sound familiar to you as to how outsiders or city folks will refer to poor rural people today? And that modern contempt for local folks here continues to make it hard for us to organize working folks in our own communities. So back in episode 5, we described the events of the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike. And those years of organizing produced a number of labor leaders who would go on to play prominent roles in the years to come that we're going to talk about. But those labor organizers weren't the only ones who had learned from the events of 1912 and 1913. Coal operators associations in southern West Virginia had also strengthened their strategy for combating the attempts to organize the labor forces. And when the end of World War I resulted in a national recession, and wealth was being consolidated into the hands of the industrial corporate powers, coal operators laid off miners and reduced wages to pre-war levels. At the same time, the unions had lost a lot of their foothold in the southern mountains of West Virginia. And in 1919, the largest non-unionized coal region in the eastern United States consisted of Logan and Mingo counties, which are basically the focal point of this entire episode. As the rich mine owners got richer, union-organized strikes became a way for miners to protect their own salaries. So, given the lack of unionized workers in Logan and Mingo counties, the United Mine Workers of America targeted that area of the state specifically as its top priority. Meanwhile, the industry elite were not about to let another worker uprising happen on their watch. So, Logan Coal Operators Association paid Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin to keep union organizers out of the area. And this is a name that you are going to hear more of because Sheriff Chafin became known and heavily disliked for his anti-union actions. He hired a small army of additional deputies paid directly by the association to help carry out his agenda, and he and his deputies harassed, beat, and arrested those that were suspected of participating in labor meetings. On July 1st of 1919, the UMW miners went on strike in the region. By this time, over 90% of Mingo County's miners had joined the union. Over the next 13 months, a virtual war existed in the county. Non-union mines were dynamited, miners' tent colonies were attacked, and there were numerous deaths on both sides of the cause. During this period, Governors Cornwell and Morgan declared martial law on 3 occasions. Naturally, they sided with the corporate elite coal operators. In the late summer of that year, 1919, as rumors reached Charleston of the violence and atrocities that were being committed by Chafin's men and the Baldwin-Felts anti-union detectives that had been hired, miners began planning for a march on Logan County. On September 4th, armed miners began gathering, and by the 5th, their numbers had grown to 5,000. The governor met with union leaders, and they were able to come to an agreement for a government investigation into the alleged abuses of the coal operators in exchange for calling off the march. Some of the workers marched on, regardless of the bargain, and they made their way to Danville and Boone County before turning back. The commission that had been appointed by the governor to conduct the investigation, surprise, surprise, did not present any findings in support of the union. And ultimately, a few months later, coal operators again lowered wages in the southern coal fields. To compound problems, the U.S. Coal Commission granted a wage increase to union miners which excluded those in southwestern West Virginia. So in response to all of this, in January of 1920, an intentional drive was launched by the United Mine Workers to unionize the rest of southern West Virginia. It was a bloody uphill battle, literally. Gunfights, explosions, and other forms of conflict were all over the coal towns where miners were fighting the newly established state police, as well as the mine guards and the hired strike breakers. The UMW's organizing efforts led to a bitter 28-month-long strike. That, my friends, is conviction. In May of 1920, the Battle of the Tug erupted in Mingo County, where miners were determined to stop coal production, and 3 days of unabated violence took place on a 10-mile front along the Tug Fork. On May 6th, Union leaders spoke to around 3,000 miners right next door at Matewan, and in the following 2 weeks, about half that many joined the United Mine Workers of America. But there was no way that the coal operators were going to make it easy for the unionizing workers. Who are we kidding? In response to this massive organizing effort by the United Mine Workers in the area, the local mine companies forced miners to sign yellow dog contracts that bound them to never join a union. And on May 19th, 12 union-busting Baldwin Felts detectives arrived in Matewan to evict the families of the miners that had just joined the union from their company-owned houses. It's said that the first family they evicted was a woman and her children. The woman's husband wasn't home at the time, according to legend. And the story says that they forced them out at gunpoint and threw their belongings in the road under a light but steady rain. Ooh, but those Baldwin Felts detectives should have known better. Fuck around in Appalachia and find out, my friends. When those union busters tried to board a train to just boot, scoot, and boogie back to where they came from, they were confronted by the mayor of Matewan himself and the chief of police, the legend, Sid Hatfield, a former UMWA miner himself. According to one version of this story, the Baldwin Felts agents tried to arrest Hatfield when he attempted to prevent the evictions from taking place of those miners' families. And when the mayor defended Hatfield from the arrest, he was shot and more bullets began to fly. In another version of the story, Hatfield initiated the violence, either by giving some kind of signal to armed miners that were stationed around the town or by just firing his gun first. Either way, within 15 minutes, 10 people were dead, 7 detectives, 2 miners, and the mayor. And the event became known as the Matewan Massacre. The events of Matewan provided a source of huge momentum for organizing efforts. It had a symbolic significance that was enormous for the miners. This seemingly invincible detective agency, Baldwin Felts, had been beaten for once. And Chief Sid Hatfield had become a living legend, a hero to the union miners, a symbol of hope that the oppression of the coal operators and their hired guns could, in fact, be overthrown. Through the end of the year and into 1921, the Union continued to gain strength in Mingo County. But so did the resistance of the coal operators, who were determined to keep making their money because that's what it was all about, right? They were able to reopen around 80% of the mines with armed guards and imported replacement workers. As the Union was growing in strength and the coal operators were building their resistance, by mid-May of 1921, the unionized miners launched a full-scale assault on the non-union mines. In a short amount of time, the conflict consumed the entire Tug River Valley because it's totally rational and normal for the government to step in and side with corporate profit and subdue the workers with violence if necessary. That is sarcasm, by the way. That is sarcasm. Because that is totally normal, martial law was declared, leading to the arrest of hundreds of miners. The smallest of infractions meant imprisonment for the workers. Meanwhile, the industry leaders on the side of law and order, who were killing hundreds and thousands of workers every year and who were abusing and exploiting and commodifying their families and their labor, those folks were seen as immune. Given all of this context, at least to me, and I hope to you too, it makes complete sense that the miners responded with low-key guerrilla tactics and sabotage. As all of this tension is building, on August 1st of 1921, Sid Hatfield, our legend, was called to stand trial for a shooting at the Mohawk coal camp in McDowell County. Now, at this point, he had already been acquitted for the events in Matewan. Those had taken place the previous year, so this was totally unrelated. As he and a fellow defendant, Ed Chambers, walked up the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse, in theatrical fashion, shots rang out. Hatfield and Chambers were murdered in cold blood by the Baldwin Felts anti-union thugs. So the news starts spreading of how Sid and Ed had been killed in cold blood, which triggers, of course, the next chapter in the mine wars, the moment that we have all been waiting for. Armed miners gathered by the thousands, streaming out of the hills and the hollows in West Virginia. Many wore blue overalls and tied red bandanas around their necks as a uniform that unified the gathering workers, who were made up of a mixture of Appalachian hill folk from Scots-Irish ancestry, African Americans who had migrated out of the Deep South, and immigrants from European countries. The red bandanas were also a symbolic gesture, an attempt to reclaim the word redneck, which had been used as a pejorative against the working class folks throughout history. That's what the entire first episode of this podcast is about. A generation of labor conflict in the West Virginia coal fields was culminating in what would erupt as the largest open class war in United States history. Sid Hatfield was killed on August 1st, and on August 7th, a crowd estimated to be anywhere as large as 5,000 folks gathered on the Capitol grounds in Charleston to protest the killing of Hatfield and Chambers, and to present their demands in regards to workers' rights to Governor Morgan. The miners assembled later that night with the intention to march south to overthrow the governor's proclamation of martial law in Mingo County, to free imprisoned miners, and to wipe out the anti-union mine guard. Only one thing stood in their way: Sheriff Don Chafin and his private army. Oh, and the giant physical barrier that was the actual Blair Mountain itself, of course. Remember Mother Jones? She had been a critical support in the labor organizing efforts up to this point, but she predicted what would be the inevitable failure of the mission, and she tried to discourage the miners. Her discouragement was not received in kind. Instead, union leaders started traveling around the state, recruiting miners to the march, and within 2 weeks, the miners began assembling. World War I vets among the miners helped to organize the marchers along military lines, and they used sentries, patrols, codes, and passwords. They even had their own doctors and nurses and medical and sanitary facilities, commissaries, and food tents. It was truly a self-sustaining community. By August 24th, forces among the marchers had grown to include around 10,000. Following the long-standing traditions of the labor organizers before them, they had planned to congregate and hold rallies and speeches for a number of days as they marched to Logan County and crossed Blair Mountain. The difference between this march and the marches of their ancestors was that by 1921, Both sides of the class war had accumulated a large store of weaponry, including machine guns and high-powered rifles. In case you're like me and you have no short-term retention of information as a result of ADHD, as a friendly reminder, Sid Hatfield was killed on August 1st. On August 25th, this 10,000-some marchers began arriving at Blair Mountain, where Sheriff Don Chafin, remember him? Remember Don? Continuing with his legacy of anti-unionism in southern West Virginia, Sheriff Chafin met them there with a combined force of his deputies, mine guards. There were some class traitor civilian volunteers and a few others who all worked together to fortify their position on top of the ridge of Blair Mountain. And they were armed with machine guns and explosives and a whole collection of firearms. At this point, since it was totally normal for the government to just step in and protect the interests of the corporate elite, and the state government had not been effective at doing that, at this point, the federal government decides to step in. And they attempt to elicit the union leaders to issue an ultimatum telling the miners to end the march. But, what do they have to lose? So they just keep on marching. 3 days later, marching miners learned that some of the deputies under Sheriff Chafin had killed 5 of the pro-union men. And this news, of course, just lit a fire under the marchers and gave them the energy that they needed to push on to the peak of Blair Mountain. And at this point, skirmishes were already breaking out in the area all around the mountain, and the marchers took their first prisoners. 4 Logan County deputies and the son of another deputy. On the evening of the 30th, the miners were joined by a small armed company that had been organized by a Baptist minister named James E. Wilburn. The first day of open war began on the next morning, the last day of August, with miners starting their assault on Chafin's army and killing 3 of Chafin's deputies. They lost one of their own Union supporters during the fight. By September 1st, the miners had captured half of the 25-mile mountain ridge, and they were ready to descend upon Logan. You can imagine that the mainstream media, who had to lift up the powers to which they were beholden, used all of this to support the narratives that they had been weaving for a long time against the working class folks. The whole first episode, the whole idea behind the term rednecks, right? Chatham University historian Louis Martin, who is also one of the founding members of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, described how national papers sold a lot of copies by portraying this area, the West Virginia area that was participating in these worker uprisings, as a lawless land where the mountaineers were inherently violent. It was a totally hyperbolized version of events, creating this wild, wild west type of image of Appalachia that obviously did not lead to widespread public support for the miners and the struggles that they were trying to overcome. So we've got these coal operators controlling every aspect of the miners' lives, abusing them, murdering them en masse. We've got the Baldwin Felts detectives being hired to stop the miners who were unionizing together. We've got strike breakers. We've got the state government stepping in and declaring martial law, and Sheriff Don Chafin and all of these forces still were not enough to stop the conviction and the persistence that these organizing miners had. So President Harding places the strike zone under federal martial law. And on September 2nd, mobilizes federal troops and a squadron of bomber aircraft into the state. According to folks from the West Virginia Mine War Museum, some of the miners were unwilling to resist the U.S. soldiers because they were veterans themselves. So the miners agreed to lay down their guns. While some of the miners on Blair Mountain continued on fighting until the 4th, by September 5th, the battlefield was quiet. During what totaled roughly 5 days of fighting, it's estimated that over 1 million rounds were fired, and upwards of 12 miners and at least 4 men from Chaffin's side were killed. Folks who surrendered were placed on trains and sent home, but the folks that were perceived to be the leaders of this movement had to be held accountable for the actions of all the miners in order to send a message loud and clear against this kind of organizing. Special grand juries handed down more than 1,200 indictments, including more than 300 for murder and 24 for treason against the state. All in all, the magnitude and level of violence involved in this class struggle of the decade between 1912 and 1921 is so immense that the era has come to be known as the Mine Wars. The era encompasses the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek Mine War that we talked about in episode 5 between 1912 and 1913, the Mingo Mine Wars, the Battle of the Tug that we talked about in this episode in 1921, and the March of Logan in 1921, which was so much more than a march because it itself really encompassed the Battle of Blair Mountain, the Matewan Massacre, and the assassination of Sid Hatfield. For capitalists, it was a battle for profit. It was a battle against what they saw as Bolshevik communism. For workers, it was a fight for their rights as humans. And the final insurrection was an attempt by the workers to gain basic human rights. They were sick of the years and generations of suffering and death that had been forced upon them. This was a demonstration of open class warfare at the heart of American capitalism. Even though this conflict was the second largest rebellion in America next to the Civil War, this battle has largely been forgotten. And I think we have to stop and ask ourselves, why is that? Who benefits when we forget about a bloody uprising of workers who have been forsaken by the capitalist system which depends upon the labor that they provide? The miners realized that in order to be successful, they needed to organize the same way that they worked, together. One of the articles that I was reading featured a press officer from the Industrial Workers of the World who said that the IWW was always integrated because they understood that their organizing efforts were stronger that way. They had more power that way. He said that in the early 1900s, there were a few unions that were more militant and believed that aggressive tactics won more victories, and they came together to form the IWW. And miners used militancy to make change too, whenever necessary. Specifically, the article I was reading described miners who took coal company cafeteria workers to gunpoint and forced them to serve to everybody, black, white, and immigrant, in the same room way before desegregation was legalized. They had a firm understanding that the work that they needed to be done couldn't be done if they didn't work across those lines. They had a firm understanding that their liberation was tied to the liberation of all of the workers. This kind of intersectionality was and is, honestly, absolutely necessary for the power that workers needed to build to reclaim their rights and their dignity. But it was also in direct opposition to U.S. law at the time. Capitalist America was afraid of the advantage in numbers and strength that the workers had when they came together. White America was afraid of empowered Black folks that could vote and run for elected office. And the backlash of this fear included segregation legislation that kept Black and white people apart, ultimately working to the benefit of these large capitalist structures because they tamped down revolts and prevented workers from organizing across race lines. Every time you would see a rebellion become successful and then crushed, you saw laws to separate people, one professor said from this article that I read. Like so much of our Appalachian history and the narratives that have been shaped around poor folks throughout the centuries, accounts of labor struggle in the West Virginia coal fields are almost always constructed from those same stereotypical conceptions of Appalachian culture. Labor strikes were and are seen as violent because of a backwards people that are irrational, lawless, and militant. Blair Mountain was largely portrayed in the national press as a feud between some hot-headed hillbillies instead of an economic or class conflict. So again, let's ask ourselves, who benefits from these types of narratives? Who benefits when we erase the class struggle that was at the root of these conflicts? And when we erase the attempts of multiracial labor organizing throughout history? The miners didn't get an avenue to tell their story. And so many of us throughout history have not gotten an avenue to tell our story. And we've been silenced for a really long time. And that's for a lot of reasons. Capitalist America is still afraid of the advantage in numbers and strengths that the workers have when we come together. White America is still afraid of empowered folks of color who can vote and run for elected office. When we write off our neighbors, whether they be poor white folks or poor folks of color, whether they live in a trailer park or in the inner city projects, regardless, when we write each other off, the folks who benefit are the people at the top, the folks who make their money off of our labor and our lives and our families and our struggles and our pain. And therefore, the simplest act of revolution can be to come together and start to have conversations with each other across those lines and to build networks of interconnectedness and inner survival across those lines. We can't depend on systems that were inherently built on fear and on profit to save us. We have to save us. And I guess that's probably a good place for us to stop. We can reflect on what it looks like to build really deep relationships in our own community and to lean into intersectional interdependence and mutual aid and co-survival. But before we go, we gotta know, what's the answer to today's trivia question?
So this week's trivia question was, what is the tallest peak in the Appalachian Mountains?
I think I actually know this one, Chris, because I think it's right here in Western North Carolina. Is the answer to this question Mount Mitchell?
That is correct. It is the tallest here in the Appalachian Mountains, and it stands over 6,600 feet tall.
I knew it! Thank you so much, Christopher, for enlightening the world about just how amazing Western North Carolina is. That wraps up today's episode of Rednecks Rising. And next week, we will be taking a break from our radical Appalachian ADHD history lessons to hear from another badass Appalachian that is doing good work in our mountains today. So we're going to bring it back into the present moment. While you wait for next week's episode to drop, make sure that you head over to our social media channels and give us a follow. We're at Rednecks Rising on basically everything: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, as well as follow us on our Ko-Fi page. And the easiest way to find all of those pages and platforms to listen to the podcast and share it with your friends is to visit our link tree. And so that is linktr.ee, linktr.ee, so linktree /Rednecks Rising, spelled just like it is in the podcast name, no caps, no spaces. The Linktree also has a link to our Ko-Fi, where you can join our friends who are supporting the pod on either a monthly basis or throwing a tip our way every now and again, or supporting some sick merch, which I hope to make more of very soon. And in general, even if you don't support the pod financially, but you want to support us emotionally or energetically, which is just as valuable, you can follow us on Ko-Fi to stay up to date with really key information and exciting stuff. And that wraps us up for now. So long as the Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see y'all next week.